Roswell, New Mexico sits in a stretch of high desert flatland in Chaves County, dry grass and caliche soil running out toward mountains on the horizon in almost every direction. In the summer of 1947 it was, above all, a military town, home to the 509th Bomb Group, the only unit on Earth that had ever dropped an atomic weapon in war, less than 2 years removed from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 60 miles away sat the Trinity site, where the first bomb had been tested. Not far past that, the White Sands Range was already running its own classified programs. It was a landscape thick with secrecy before any of what follows ever happened, which is part of why what follows happened the way it did. On June 14, 1947, a sheep rancher named William Mack Brazel was riding the J.B. Foster spread with his 8-year-old son, roughly 75 miles northwest of Roswell, when he came across a long scatter of wreckage across a pasture. Rubber strips, tinfoil, sticks that looked like balsa wood, a tough, greyish paper that wouldn't tear. Some of the tape binding it together carried a repeating pattern of small flower-like shapes stamped in violet ink. Brazel had found weather balloons on his land before, twice, and this didn't look like either of them, but it also didn't look especially dramatic. He gathered up a little of it, left most of it where it lay, and went back to work. He had no telephone out there and no particular urgency. Whatever this was, it could wait. It waited 3 weeks. On July 4th, a storm passed through and scattered the debris further across the field, and Brazel went back out to gather more of it, with his wife and 2 of his children, hauling some of it home. By then he had started hearing talk in town about flying saucers, a phrase that had entered the American vocabulary only 2 weeks earlier, on June 24, after a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold reported 9 crescent-shaped objects near Mount Rainier, Washington, moving at a speed he estimated in the thousands of miles an hour. The country was primed, almost overnight, to see saucers, and Brazel began to wonder if what he was standing in the middle of might be connected. On July 7th, in town to sell wool, he stopped at the office of Chaves County Sheriff George Wilcox and told him, as Brazel later put it, in a low and half-embarrassed voice, that he might have found a flying disc on his property. Wilcox called Roswell Army Airfield. The call reached Major Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer for the 509th Bomb Group, the only nuclear-capable bomb group in the world at that time, based at Roswell. Marcel, by every account of that day, was excited by what he was hearing. He and a counterintelligence officer named Sheridan Cavett drove out to the ranch with Brazel, and the following morning, July 7 into July 8, the 2 men spent hours combing the field and gathering as much of the material as they could fit into the trunk of Marcel's car and the back of Cavett's Jeep. It was scattered, by most accounts, over an area roughly 200 yards long. Nothing about the description in the contemporary records suggests a hull, an engine, a cockpit, or a single coherent structure. It suggests debris. Marcel drove back to Roswell in the small hours of July 8th, reportedly so struck by what he'd seen that he stopped at his own house before dawn to wake his family and show them some of it spread across the kitchen table. He reported to the base commander, Colonel William Blanchard, later that morning. Blanchard, for reasons that no surviving document fully explains, made a decision that the United States military has almost never repeated before or since. He authorized his public information officer, First Lieutenant Walter Haut, to tell the world that the Army had captured a flying disc. Haut wrote the release himself and drove it around Roswell in person, dropping copies at both local radio stations and both newspapers. By 2:26 that afternoon, it was moving on the Associated Press wire. The Roswell Daily Record ran it that evening, under the headline, "RAF Captures Flying Saucer on Ranch in Roswell Region," and by nightfall, the story was running in newspapers across the country and being read aloud on network radio. For a period of somewhere between 12 and 20 hours, the United States Army Air Forces held, as an official public position, that it had recovered a flying disc. That fact alone is the load-bearing strangeness of Roswell. Nothing else in the story needs to be invented to make it worth telling. It was already true. It did not survive the day. Marcel had been ordered to fly a portion of the material toward Wright Field in Ohio for analysis by Army Air Force's intelligence, the highest technical authority in the chain, but the transport carrying him set down first at Fort Worth Army Airfield in Texas, headquarters of the 8th Air Force. There, Brigadier General Roger Ramey had the debris spread out on his office floor for reporters and photographers. He called in his base weather officer, Warrant Officer Irving Newton, to take a look. Newton would later say he walked in, glanced down, and laughed. "That's what's left of a roaring target," he told the room, referring to a lightweight radar reflector, built on a frame of thin balsa struts and covered in foil-backed paper, flown beneath a weather balloon to track wind speed at altitude. He said devices exactly like it were in routine use at some 80 weather stations around the country. Marcel, in Newton's later account, tried to point out faint markings on some of the sticks, lavender and pink in color, and suggested they might be some kind of writing. Newton said he wasn't convinced, that the marks looked like ordinary weather-faded printing to him, the kind stamped by the manufacturer. Photographs from that afternoon in Ramey's office are, to this day, the single most reproduced image connected to the entire Roswell story. Marcel and Ramey and other officers crouched around torn foil and broken sticks laid out across the carpet. In one of those photographs, Ramey is holding a single sheet of paper, angled toward the camera, that has never been fully legible in any surviving print. Researchers have spent decades running that fragment through image enhancement, arguing over whether certain words on it can be made out at all, and if so, whether they read as ordinary damage control language about weather balloons or something else entirely. No consensus exists. It remains one of the few pieces of the primary 1947 photographic record that is still genuinely, technically disputed rather than settled, and it is worth being honest that it has never been resolved either way. By morning, the story had already reversed itself. The Roswell paper's own follow-up ran under the headline, "General Ramey Empties Roswell Saucer," describing the debris as a weather balloon and radar target, exactly as Newton had identified it. Brazel gave one more interview, sounding tired of the whole affair, telling the paper that if he ever found anything else besides a bomb, they were going to have a hard time getting him to mention it. And that, for all practical purposes, was that. No further coverage followed in 1947. No claims of bodies, of a craft, of anything beyond torn foil and sticks appear anywhere in the documented record of that summer, not in the newspapers, not in surviving military correspondence, not in any private letter that has ever surfaced from that year. The story that decades later would become one of the most elaborate conspiracy narratives in American life spent its first 30 years as a minor, resolved, faintly embarrassing footnote that almost nobody thought worth repeating. That silence is worth sitting with, because it complicates everything that came after it. If something extraordinary had genuinely been recovered, and understood as extraordinary by the men who handled it in July 1947, it is a strange thing that not one of them said so for 3 decades. No deathbed statements in the 1950s, no leaked memos in the 1960s. No investigative reporting in the early 1970s, at the exact moment the American press was at its most aggressive about digging up buried government secrets. In the years surrounding Watergate, Roswell simply wasn't a story. It had already been told and closed in about 18 hours. What reopened it was a single interview. In 1978, a nuclear physicist and UFO researcher named Stanton Friedman tracked down Jesse Marcel, by then a retired lieutenant colonel living a quiet life, and asked him about that week in 1947. Marcel talked. He said the weather balloon explanation the Army gave to the press had been a cover story, that what he had personally gathered in that field was unlike anything he recognized from his military experience, thinner and stranger, and in his account, somehow both lighter and tougher than balsa wood and foil had any right to be. He speculated, and it was framed at the time as speculation, that it might have been something not of this earth. He did not, in that original interview, describe bodies. He did not describe a craft. He described unfamiliar debris and a cover story, and he said he'd waited 30 years to say so because he'd been told, at the time, not to talk about it. That interview became the seed of a book. In 1980, the writer Charles Berlitz, who had previously turned the Bermuda Triangle into a best-selling phenomenon, partnered with researcher William Moore to publish the Roswell incident, built around Marcel's account and a handful of newly gathered interviews with other aging witnesses. It sold in the millions of copies. It is also, as far as the documented history of this story goes, the very first place that the words alien bodies appear in print in connection with Roswell. Not in 1947, not at any point in the following 3 decades. 1980, in a mass-market paperback, more than 30 years after the balloon came down. Everything that most people now associate with Roswell traces back to the wave of claims that followed that book through the 1980s and into the 1990s. A mortician named Glenn Dennis, who came forward in 1989, describing a warning he said he'd received about small bodies at the base hospital. Other former airmen and civilians describing crash sites, retrieved craft, military units cordoning off desert roads, and small grey figures being moved under guard. Some of these accounts are detailed and consistent with each other in striking ways. Others contradict one another on basic points, including where the debris field actually was, and several witnesses gave different, incompatible locations for a supposed second site over the years. None of it is contemporaneous. All of it was collected by researchers starting in the late 1970s and 1980s, asking elderly men and women to recall, in specific and vivid detail, a handful of days from 30 or 40 years earlier. That doesn't make every account false. It does mean none of it belongs to the same category of evidence as the newspaper wire reports and the press release, which were written down within hours of the events they describe. In between, the story acquired at least one layer that even most serious researchers now treat as a dead end. In 1984, a set of documents began circulating among UFO investigators, purporting to be the minutes of a secret presidential committee called Majestic 12, supposedly convened by Harry Truman to manage the recovery and cover-up of the Roswell craft and its occupants. The papers were publicized widely starting in 1987. The Air Force's own Office of Special Investigations examined them and referred the matter to the FBI's Dallas field office, and in November 1988, the Air Force announced flatly that the documents were fabricated. No credible chain of custody was ever established for how they had reportedly turned up in an investigator's mailbox on a roll of undeveloped film. The episode illustrates something about how this story grew. Not every addition to it came from a witness remembering something. Some of it came from documents that were, on examination, simply invented. The next real turn in the story came not from a witness but from Congress, and it is the one part of this history that produced an actual paper trail worth trusting. In March 1993, Representative Stephen Schiff of New Mexico, a self-described skeptic rather than a believer, wrote to Secretary of Defense Les Aspin asking for a definitive explanation of what had happened outside Roswell 45 years earlier. The Pentagon didn't answer him directly. It routed the inquiry to the National Archives, which told his office it had nothing on file. Schiff, unsatisfied with being brushed off by his own government, turned to the General Accounting Office, the investigative arm of Congress, and asked it to go looking on his behalf. The GAO, in turn, directed the Air Force to search its own records for anything connected to the case. That search, which ran through 1994, turned up something genuinely real. A program called Project Mogul. Mogul had been a joint effort between the Army Air Forces and a team of scientists from New York University, its purpose to detect Soviet nuclear weapons tests by listening for the faint acoustic signature of a shock wave traveling through the upper atmosphere. It used long trains of balloons, not a single balloon but strings of them tied together, sometimes stretching more than 600 feet, carrying sensitive microphones, radar reflectors, and other instruments up to the edge of the stratosphere, launched out of Alamogordo Army Airfield under the direction of an engineer named Charles B. Moore, with Colonel Marcellus Duffy and later Captain Albert Trakowski overseeing the broader project. The acoustic detection purpose of the program was classified Top Secret, Priority 1A, one of the highest classification levels in the country at the time. But the balloon launches themselves were dressed up publicly as ordinary weather research, because that was the simplest way to keep prying eyes away from what the balloons were actually listening for. Which meant that if one of those balloon trains came apart and scattered across a rancher's field, what would be left behind, to anyone without the security clearance to know what Mogul actually was, would look exactly like foil, rubber, sticks, and tape. The Air Force's 1994 report and a follow-up in 1997 identified a specific flight as the likely source of the Foster Ranch debris, NYU Flight Number 4, launched from Alamogordo on June 4, 1947, and tracked moving east-northeast toward the town of Corona before ground crews lost contact with it, at a point roughly 17 miles from where Brazel would find his debris 10 days later. That is a real, named, dated balloon flight, documented in records declassified from the National Archives, not an explanation invented after the fact to fit an inconvenient story. It is also not airtight. The field notebook of Dr. Albert Crary, one of the Mogul scientists working at Alamogordo that summer, appears to contain a note that no launch took place on June 4th because of weather. That is the strongest specific objection serious researchers on both sides of this argument still raise, because if Flight 4 never left the ground, it cannot be the source of debris found 10 days later. The Air Force's response, laid out in its own report, is that a planned daytime launch may have been scrubbed and a flight sent up earlier that morning instead, and that the balloon train's tracking equipment failed shortly after launch, which is exactly why no one from the Mogul team ever logged it as recovered and went looking for it. That is a plausible way to reconcile the gap. It is not proof that the gap doesn't exist. It remains one of the only places in this entire 79-year-old story where a document actually on file, written by one of the scientists involved, at the time, sits in some tension with the government's own official explanation. The 1997 Air Force report, formerly titled the Roswell Report, Case Closed, was written specifically to address the later claims of small bodies. Its conclusion was that witnesses describing figures at or near a crash site were most likely recalling anthropomorphic test dummies used in high-altitude parachute and deceleration research conducted at nearby New Mexico test ranges under programs called High Dive and Excelsior. There's a chronological problem with that explanation that deserves to be stated plainly rather than smoothed over. Those dummy drop programs ran from 1953 to 1959, 6 to 12 years after 1947. Nobody in 1947 described bodies, in any account written down at the time. The Air Force's own position isn't that anyone actually confused a 1947 test with dummies that didn't exist yet. It's that elderly witnesses, describing memories decades old by the time anyone thought to ask them, may over the years have folded together separate events that happened in the same general stretch of New Mexico desert at different points in their lives. Whether that's a fair account of how memory works under those conditions, or a convenient way for an investigation to close an uncomfortable file, is a real disagreement among people who have studied this closely, and it is not one this account is going to pretend to settle. What can be said with confidence is narrower and firmer. There is no document, photograph, telegram, or private letter from 1947 that mentions a body of any kind. Every account of bodies enters the historical record through interviews conducted in the 1980s and 1990s, about a handful of nights that were, by then, 30 to 50 years gone. There is one more document in this story that deserves to be taken seriously precisely because it doesn't fit neatly into either the skeptical or the believing version of events, and it involves the closest thing this case has to a primary eyewitness to its opening hour, Walter Haut, the lieutenant who physically wrote and hand-delivered the original press release on July 8, 1947. For decades afterward, in interview after interview through the late 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s, Haut gave a consistent account of his own limited role. He said he had drafted the release on Blanchard's direct order, that he personally believed something extraordinary had happened, but that he had no first-hand knowledge of the debris itself and had not seen bodies or a craft. That was his story, told the same way for the better part of 3 decades. In December 2002, at 80 years old, Haut signed a notarized affidavit describing something entirely different, a trip to Hangar 84 with Colonel Blanchard himself, where he said he was shown an intact egg-shaped craft roughly 12 feet long, along with the bodies of several small beings with disproportionately large heads. He asked that the document remain sealed until after his death. He died in December 2005. The affidavit was published 2 years later in a book by researchers Thomas Carey and Donald Schmidt. It has never been reconciled with Haut's own prior sworn statement from 1993, which mentions neither a second crash site nor any personal viewing of bodies, and other researchers have pointed out that the affidavit was drafted by Schmidt himself after years of conversation with an elderly man, then reviewed and signed rather than written independently in Haut's own hand. Whether it represents a truth an honorable man kept buried for 55 years out of duty, or a late and heavily guided embellishment of a story Haut had spent decades helping to build, is a genuine, open dispute among people who take this case seriously, and it is not one a search of the primary record can settle. Strip away those accumulated layers, the 1978 reopening, the 1980 book that gave the story its alien framing, the majestic 12 papers that turned out to be invented, and the sealed affidavit that surfaced only after the one man who could be asked about it was no longer alive to answer questions, and what survives in the primary documentary record from 1947 itself is narrower than either the government's dismissive version of events or the mythology's elaborate one. It genuinely shows a press release calling the debris a flying disc, issued and withdrawn within about a day. It genuinely shows a weather balloon and radar target explanation offered immediately, consistently, and on the record by every official present, and never revised by any of them at the time. It genuinely shows a real classified program, Project Mogul, whose declassified flight logs plausibly, though not perfectly, match the material Brazel described. It genuinely shows a documented 30-year silence before a single extraordinary claim entered the public record. It genuinely shows one unresolved gap in one scientist's own field notebook, and one photograph from that first afternoon that has never been fully read, no matter how many times it's been enhanced. What it does not show, anywhere in the papers, wires, and private correspondence of 1947 itself, is a body, a crew, a message, or a craft. Those arrived later, carried in by decades of memory, grief, imagination, professional researchers with books to sell, and the simple human appetite for a story in which a piece of torn foil in a sheep pasture, however genuinely strange for an afternoon in July, was never quite big enough to hold on its own. None of this requires anyone to feel foolish for finding the case compelling. A military that announces a flying disc to the world and retracts it within a day, a scientist's field notebook that doesn't quite line up with the government's own explanation, a press photograph that has resisted 79 years of technical analysis, and the sworn final words of the one man who wrote the original announcement, arriving only after he could no longer be asked a single follow-up question. Those are strange, textured, genuinely unresolved details sitting inside a case that is, at its documented core, a great deal smaller than the mythology built on top of it. The honest answer to what happened outside Roswell in the summer of 1947 is not a cover-up of visitors from somewhere else, and it is not, quite, a closed case either. It is a stretch of desert, a rancher who almost didn't bother reporting what he found, a balloon program secret enough that its own base commander may never have heard of it, and 79 years of a country deciding, collectively, that the second version of the story was so much more interesting than the paperwork that it was worth keeping alive.